Now, in terms of what kind of vampire is Bram Stoker writing, the cool thing about Bram Stoker's Dracula is that it really is so original, even though the vampire is already out there. We talked about there's four different types of vampires in literature and in art at the time. There was the Byronic vampire, the Lord Ruthven, who was the aristocrat that feeds off of high society women. Okay, so that's it. And you can see that in Dracula. There's a big influence of that in Dracula. Definitely the Byronic vampire. There's the other type vampire, and Christopher Frayling points this out quite well, who are sometimes you'll find stories or accounts where the vampire is like a beast or a flower or something like that, some othering kind of creature that, feeds or sucks blood and whatnot. And you can see that a little bit in Dracula, just in terms of the enormity of his power, all the forms he can take. We'll talk about Thalaba the Destroyer here in a moment, but taking the form of just mist itself, So there's that. There's the folkloric vampire, which is the one from the stories of, Bulgaria, Austria, Romania, all these places. Folkloric vampires they're the zombies, people would the folkloric vampire is supposed to come back and feed upon their families, basically, and families would go exhume the bodies of their recently dead, and they didn't know much about physiology back then, so they see these bloated corpses, when their corpses are bloated from the gases, as the decomposition takes place, but they didn't know. They think this is a corpse that's gorged itself on blood the night before, so they would put a stake through their, dead ones in the grave, and the idea was to stake them to the ground, keep them from being able to get up, put a stake through their heart to stake them to the ground to keep them from getting up. That's where we get the idea eventually of just a stake through the heart for a vampire to kill them. Things like garlic, was sometimes be used to dress a dead body, in terms of the odor, or there are different conflicting stories here and there about it, but that came from the folkloric vampire, which Bram Stoker takes a lot of this from. He takes the idea of the stake. He takes the idea of decapitate, chopping off the head. This was something they would do to corpses. Takes the idea of the garlic and whatnot. So that folkloric vampire. And then finally, the dangerous woman. And we haven't really talked about Carmilla yet, but maybe we should spend a few moments on this. Like I said, we're definitely not going to cover all of Dracula tonight. It's definitely going to at least be a two-parter. So come back next week for the rest of it. We still got some more time to talk about it tonight, though. Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu was a very famous vampire novel of the day, and certainly would have been read by Stoker as well as The Vampire by John Polidori. We'll talk more about John Polidori's in a moment here. But Carmilla is about this woman, this young girl vampire, who preys upon this other young girl. And there's absolutely, if you want to talk about homoerotic tensions, Carmilla, it's 100% in there. In fact, you get the idea that this vampire, a little bit more overtly than something like Christabel, this vampiress is infatuated with this girl of like 18, and manipulates things to where she's kind of taken into her home and being guarded by her father for a while, and is feeding off of this young girl. So there's an idea in Carmilla of the vampire as the sexual predator. Not only the sexual predator, but the sexual predator who can choose to slowly drain a victim. In fact, in Carmilla, when they're explaining things in the end, some of the people around, excuse me, chugging that soda, trying to burp in the microphone. Some of the people around have been attacked and died instantly. And they explain that the vampire in Carmilla can attack and kill instantly just for sustenance, just for food. But when they really are infatuated with somebody, when they have a crush, so to speak, they like to just play out that infatuation by slowly draining that person over a long period of time. And we see that in Dracula. We see that in Dracula, the way he feeds on Lucy at first and then tries to feed on Mina like that and so forth. So this is something that Stoker took from it as well. The idea of Dracula as sort of a sexual predator. What I mean by sexual predator, I don't mean that, Carmilla wasn't like raping her characters, and Dracula himself isn't actually having sex with these women. You can maybe read through the lines and try and think that. I guess it doesn't technically say he doesn't, But that's not what I mean by sexual predator, because it's not. I don't think it's intended by Stoker that he's actually, you know, having sex with these women. The idea is that it's a very sexual in nature. You know, I've talked about this before in previous Halloween videos. The idea of the vampire coming in through a young girl's window when she's in bed, she's partially dressed. He sees part of her skin exposed. He sees her décollage, you know, the throat and chest area. The vampire becomes aroused. His fangs start to grow. Part of his body starts to grow at the arousal of this, you know. And he penetrates his victim, you know, with his fangs. And there's a flowing of blood. There's the exchange of fluids, you know. There's, you know, it's a very sexual thing. And Stoker himself was not. He in fact, Stoker would have said that he's in favor of censorship, especially if it gets too sexual or something like that. So you can make all kind of speculations. Did he know how sexual this was, or did he feel like the sexuality of Dracula was enough under the layers to be okay? You know, it wasn't overt pornography by any means. But to the best of my knowledge, Dracula is the one that brings in the idea that the victim, in order to be turned into a vampire, has to drink the vampire's blood as well. I don't know if this is anywhere else. Varney the vampire says that if a victim is bitten over and over and over and fed on by a vampire over and over and over, then eventually, if they die from that, they could become a vampire. But to the best of my knowledge, and I could do a little more research before I really state it boldly, Dracula's the first one that brings in the idea that, you know, Dracula can feed on you, but if you drink his blood, that's when you become a vampire as well. And that's what we see with Lucy and Mina and so forth. So there's that idea as well. Now, Stoker would have worked in the theater, in the theater world. When John Polidori's The Vampire came out, you know, earlier in the century, big hit, you know, people thinking Lord Byron wrote it. There was an immediate adaptation to the stage. There was a lot of different stage adaptations of it. One of the most popular is what was it called? The Bride of it was The Vampire, The Bride of the I forget the name of it. The Bride of the Highlands, or The Bride of something like that. It was set in Scotland. And the reason they set it in Scotland was this particular theater that was adapting it had a overflow of Scottish kilts and whatnot, of Scottish costumes. So they just decided to set the whole thing in Scotland. I forget the name, but you can look at Vampire John Polidori play version. It's The Bride of something. I'm blanking on the name right now. And there were a lot of different stage adaptations of it. After Polidori died, you know, we talked about him killing himself. You know, he his sister was married. He ended up becoming the uncle of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who is a wonderful poet, a great artist. He and his sister, Christina Rossetti, I think that's her name, a great artist, great writer rather. They're labeled in the movement of the pre-Raphaelites. They're called. They want to go back before all of this Enlightenment stuff, and they want to go back to the classics, you know, even before Raphael and that kind of idea, in terms of writing and art and everything like that. And Dante Gabriel Rossetti, so he would have been nephew by marriage to John Polidori, the writer of The Vampire. And Dante Gabriel Rossetti is the next door neighbor of Bram Stoker. And again, right now we're just looking at, we haven't even gotten to really looking at the themes of the book yet. I'm just talking about things from Stoker's life that show up in the book, because we're going to tie them together to the themes of the book in a moment. There's a story from Hall Caine, you know, the novelist friend of both Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Bram Stoker. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, he's a poet. He had a wife who passes away, dies early in her life. And the story is that Dante Gabriel Rossetti wrote a book of love poems for his wife, and he buried them with her. Now, this is the day, back in the day, when you didn't have, you know, copies on your computer of everything you wrote. So this copy of love poems was it. That was the love poems he wrote, and he buried it with this, with his dead wife. You know, beautiful romantic gesture. Okay, so she's been buried for a couple years or whatever. But then the story goes that Dante Gabriel Rossetti wants to maybe publish those poems, you know, in honor of his wife. not taking it back from her, but he thinks, that they're buried in the casket with her, which is a beautiful gesture. But if I took them out and published them as just sort of a living tribute to her, so he gets permission to have her body exhumed, and they exhume her body, and they take off the lid of the casket, and they see that her corpse is just so well preserved. Her golden red curls are still, her body's just so well preserved, and she's holding the book on her chest where he, placed it there before she was buried. And he reaches down to take the book, and some of the curls fall off, of course. And then immediately, because something, maybe the casket was just sealed the right way or whatever, but because of the outside air hitting her body, immediately it just starts to like turn to dust, and decompose quite quickly before their eyes. That's the story. Who knows if it's true or not, but it is a story that was told to Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker heard this story from his neighbor, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, from his friend Hall Caine. And so this is, something else you see showing up in Dracula when they go to Miss Lucy's tomb, and they see her just looking even more beautiful in death, than she was at the end of her life, and so forth. So you see a lot of these things showing up in Bram Stoker's life, in the Dracula from Bram Stoker's life. And I think that's always a good place to start if you're really going to understand a novel. If it's a masterful work that is stuck with culture and continues to influence culture, especially for something like Dracula, it's still with us now and today in the 2024, and this was 1880 or 1897. I forget the exact date it was published. So centuries later, or a century later at least. I think it's important to look at the things that came from the author's life, and because that's how you'll really fully understand the themes in the book, and how they apply to the culture of the time, but how they continue to apply to culture throughout ages, and why they're still with us today and so important to us today. It's like Stephen King. If you've ever read Stephen King's novel or autobiography On Writing, it's part autobiography talking about his life, and he points out a lot of the things that happened in his life that you see show up in his work. And then the second half is the real nuts and bolts of his thoughts about writing and language and prose styling and so forth. So it's, you use your experiences for that. And we'll definitely get to that. Or we'll wrap it up some more. Maybe I'll just kind of wrap. We're at the hour mark. There is something to be said too for the idea of the fangs in vampires. That came from Varney the vampire. The fangs, seeing the fangs. In film, it was first done with Nosferatu, the sort of rat-like fangs, the two fangs in the front. It wasn't until Christopher Lee's Dracula that we saw the traditional fangs, on the sides, like, these wonderful traditional fangs of Dracula, which are just so aesthetic. I mean, that's the way that we think of vampire fangs now. There is some work that's being done on the folkloric vampire, and how the ideas, or how it was explained that the folkloric vampire would have originally fed on you. It wasn't that he had two fangs here, because you think if your two eye teeth, I mean, it's horrible to think about. Think about if you actually bit into somebody with your two eye teeth, it'd be hard to get your teeth out, and then feed, because you'd have to bite so far down to actually draw blood. Anyway, they would say that the fangs of folkloric vampire was one top eye tooth and one bottom eye tooth, so that they would pinch the flesh in between and pierce it, almost like a piercing. And then you could easily pop your mouth out of that, and I know, wonderful to think about. But that's just the evolution of the idea of fangs, coming through there. So I talked about the literary types of vampires that are available in Stoker's day. And I'll end with this: the actual works that he wrote. These are the ones that he would have drawn from. In terms of work, like I said, he got the idea of the sexual predator and the slow draining of blood from Carmilla the Vampire from Sheridan Le Fanu, and that's a great work. If you're interested in vampires and want to read literary vampires, read Carmilla. It's really fun. It's not that long, and it's pretty fascinating. It's a pretty fun read. Varney the Vampire, like I said, I mentioned before, this was published in like the little penny dreadfuls, and you can get the hardcover, but it has to come in like a freaking box because it's so crazy long, because the writers were getting paid by the word that they wrote, and it was just serialized. So at any given time, it was just a little pamphlet in somebody's hands, and they just kept this story going forever. So if you can get through it, good on you. But it's there are some important things that Stoker took from Varney the Vampire: the idea of fangs, the idea of coming into a woman's bedroom, to feed on her, the superhuman strength of the vampire that Dracula has. This came from Varney the Vampire as well. Um, so some interesting things like that. Thalaba the Destroyer was an epic poem that was lauded. Actually, St. Cardinal Newman lauds it as an interesting tale of good versus evil. But there's just like one little line in Thalaba the Destroyer where he goes to like a cemetery, and I think, if I remember correctly, that he meets this vampire who tells him like the people that he's trying to save will eventually become vampires and so forth. But anyway, you see the vampire in mist. The vampire forms itself in mist and then comes out, what's the word? Embodies himself, incarnates out of the mist or whatever. And we see that, show up in Dracula as well. From the actual vampire, by John Polidori, he got the idea of the aristocrat, because Dracula is a wealthy man moving in these circles, feeding on women of higher class, of society and whatnot. And then, of course, from folkloric vampire, we get the idea of shape-shifting. One of the things we're going to talk about next week is the idea of the vampire now as we know it. We know Dracula is distinct from the Wolfman, but vampires and werewolves, in terms of folklore, were kind of, the lines were all kinds of blurred between the two of them. And we see this in the novel Dracula. So that Stoker drew a lot from folkloric vampires, but he even drew some from a folkloric werewolf as well. And it's interesting how it happens. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde is a big reason why we see that split, and we see werewolves becoming quite distinct from vampires. But we'll talk more about that next week. But yeah, the idea of the shape-shifting, the garlic, the crucifixes, to fight against vampires and whatnot, the staking to the ground and so forth. We haven't really talked much about it tonight. We'll get more into it next week. But Dracula is an immensely religious book. It's a very Christian novel. I would argue it's a very Catholic novel. Now, Stoker himself wasn't practicing Catholic, but he grew up in Ireland, and he certainly would have had, Catholicism around him. Van Helsing, our main hero, the main mentor of these heroes, is devoutly Catholic and is honored, or it's treated very sincerely in the novel as a devout Catholic. It doesn't, pick fun at him in that. In fact, his Catholicism, the work of actual crucifixes, are the actual consecrated host, the Eucharist, the bread that's been consecrated and is the body of Christ. Those are the things that repel Dracula. So these Anglicans, who don't believe in all of these, things, are having to like, there's a wonderful, wonderful line. And I'll end with this. I know I've said I'll end with this before, but I promise I'll end with this now. There's a wonderful line at the beginning of the novel. Jonathan Harker's on his way to meet this Count Dracula to, help him buy this land or whatever. And some of the natives in Romania and whatnot, or Transylvania, are giving him, one lady gives him a crucifix. If you must go to that castle, please take this. Take this for your mother's sake. And they talk about praying to the Virgin. Here, take this for your mother's sake. And he looks upon this crucifix and he says, I've always been, once he's in the castle, once he realizes things are a little off and he's kind of worried, but he doesn't know exactly what's going on. He's looking at this crucifix and he says, it's strange. I've been taught all my life to reject things like this. These are superstitious or whatever. The iconoclasm sort of the enlightened, even Christianity of the day. And he says, yet I find such comfort and staring at this and holding this. And he said, I must think on this more, if I'm ever getting out of here or whatever. And it's, and we see that show up a lot because there's power in symbols, and we see that as part of the ways that Dracula is fought against. So anyway, we'll go on and on and on and on. I can go on and on and on. I'll stop now. But like I said, definitely going to at least be a two-parter. We'll see how far we get next week. Heck, it might be a three-parter. Part of it's because this is like the meatiest, I think, novel of the three literary masterpieces that have come from these archetypes come from: Frankenstein, Strange Case, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Dracula. This is the meatiest one. It's the longest one, but it's also the one that I dearly love the most. And I think there's just so much to draw from it. I think it's also probably the most popular one, certainly in terms of you guys. I think you guys really love Dracula, at least from what you said. Probably more than the others, or at least as much as the others,